Hi, and welcome to BizTech's Aha, the coaching show. This is a show that's all about coaching and is produced in partnership with Corporate Coaching Academy. I'm Brian Fernandez, and today we're going to explore the title of Coaching for C-Suites. And to get a CEO to talk about this, we have Azran Osman-Rani, CEO of Naluri. Now, Azran, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Brian.
Now, Azran, for a start, now you're in a very unique position as a coach, and this is a different hat because you've been a CEO yourself. So perhaps you can start by giving the audience an overview of your corporate career, and then how you transition as into an entrepreneur,
hmm
and then how you got involved in coaching.
Sure. Well, I started the first 13 years of my corporate career, a very conventional, first in management consulting and then running business development and transformation programs for large corporations. I then spent the next 17 years unlearning all of that conventional business thinking as an entrepreneur, building a number of disruptive businesses that challenged industry status quo across a wide range of industries, right? So from heavily regulated capital intensive industries like building a long haul airline from scratch to the fast moving internet technology space to build iFlix, an emerging markets video streaming service. And in 2017, I embarked on my own digital health venture, Naluri, an employee health and well-being service.
Now,
Okay, go ahead.
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, in the context of providing employee health and well-being, we took a very unique approach of a holistic approach. So traditionally, perhaps companies might provide mental health and psychological services for employees. Very quickly, you realize that the number one cause of stress for employees today is their boss in the workplace. And as much as a psychologist can help you with coping strategies, perhaps you're going to need coaches, for example, to help you deal with upcoming tense performance appraisal discussions, conflicts in the workplace, different options for your career progression. Now, as we started to assemble a team of executive coaches that work with my psychologists, dietitians, and doctors as a team, you then start to engage the CEO and the CHRO who are trying to shape a more healthy but high performing culture. And of course, they realize they're also part of the problem. They want to do something about it. They want to lead from the front. And that's where, for someone like the C-suite executive, they're not going to use a digital app, right? They want to be able to connect and get the same level of support in a one-on-one personalized basis. And that's how we sort of broadened and expanded it into coaching for C-suite executives.
And you're, as I said at the you're quite unique in that sense because you're one of them. You're not an executive coach that's not been there and done that before. And as you outlined your experience, it's not only been there and done that, but been there and done different things. Some have worked well, some have not worked so well.
Oh, yes.
So
Spectacular failures.
and but then that's again why I think personally that makes you a great coach because you're able to sometimes because of that as you said spectacular failures but that also coupled with the successes you're able to see ahead and perhaps understand how that coach some of the things the stresses and stuff that he or she is going through.
Indeed.
As for today now, who do you coach?
Okay, well, I typically spend, a bulk of my time coaching a handful of clients each year. So I do limit my time, and they're typically, for example, a CEO embarking on a major transformation program, high growth strategy, or in some cases, a C-suite executive that's been identified as a CEO successor and the board or the outgoing CEO wants to get that person ready to step up and lead. So usually that is the profile. And in some cases, I work with an entire C-suite team, right? So for example, the CEO says, look, The nine of us in this leadership team, we've just in that forming stage. We've come together over the last 9-12 months. Can you kind of help coach and guide us so that we kind of become more cohesive as a leadership unit?
And that's really exciting stuff because, again, those are three big different scenarios.
Hmm.
And then that really requires a different toolkit that you've got to bring out from all
Hmm.
your previous experiences. Walk us through, for example, some of the things that perhaps you've and success stories of how you've helped in the transformation process. Because, and I ask that specifically because many businesses today, this
Hmm.
the CEO has been tasked by the board or the family members who own the company, or the shareholders, if it's a large public company, transform the business. We have digital transformation and so forth. So this is top of mind. Walk us through some success stories, how you've helped, a CEO really in this transformation journey.
Okay, well, if I were to pick one big theme in this past year, Brian, it is the realization that leaders today need a whole new set of superpowers, right? On one hand, they're supposed to create a culture that promotes psychological safety, well being, inclusiveness, empowerment. On the other hand, this year in particular has been brutal in demanding tough performance, cost cutting pressures, and massive change. Now, what the best performers need to realize is, how do I balance both seemingly conflicting priorities, right? And it seems like they are two sides of the same pendulum that swings back and forth. Like during the COVID pandemic, it swung all the way towards psychological safety and well-being, where diversity, inclusion, health, and well-being became board level agenda items. But this year, it seems like it swung all the way to the other side, right? With cost-cutting pressures, uh, you know, high performance expectations, uh, and yet, you know, you can't just simply say, I'm going to choose one or the other, right? How do I both lead from the front and balancing these two seemingly conflicting priorities? And that scares a lot of leaders today, right? And as you might know, being a leader today, it's incredibly lonely. You've got to in a way put up a brave front to your board members and investors. Your peers in your leadership team are always looking to judge you. How can you potentially be truly open and vulnerable to them? And so leaders now realize they need that safe space to really explore the issues, deal with the highly uncertain pressures, and kind of try to make sense of these conflicting priorities. And I think that's where coaching plays a very, very critical role. And it starts with, are you a trusted member that I can see as my safe space? So I'm going to anchor the conversation on, can we as coaches deliver trust? Right? And trust can take in the form of a few different components. It is credibility, right? Have you been through the battle zone, the kind of the trenches, for you to be able to understand what I'm going to? Can I count on you? Are you reliable? Are you authentic, right? Are you truly, can you maintain that confidential, safe space? And especially, for example, remember the second coaching scenario of working for that up and coming CEO designate, right? He or she's very concerned. How will the board and the outgoing CEO look at them? Are they going to use this coaching assignment as an assessment tool, for example? So being able to be trusted in that sense becomes paramount, to kind of really be able to be that confidant for business leaders today.
Asram, can I jump in here at this point of time? Because in your scenario too, and this happens a lot in major
Mm,
corporations, there's not one identified potential successor. There may be
mm,
two or three
yeah.
before the final selection. And the board says, look, we've done succession planning from a HR plan. This is, and this is across large organizations. We see these three people that potentially could be the next CEO.
Yeah.
Have you encountered something like that, and how do you balance the coaching with the three of them? Does that impact
Yeah.
you in any way?
So first of all, my rule is, number one, I'm coaching one person, and my primary client is my coachee, right? So I'm looking out for the best interests of my coachee, and not necessarily to report back to the CEO board on kind of assessing the coachee. If you want an assessment, there are other people, other service providers who can do that. But my job, right, is to work with that coachee, that C-suite executive, to help him or her be ready to step up and take on that role, right? So I wouldn't be in a position to say I'm going to work with two or three of them and help the board pick one. That is not my job. My job is I'm the coach to figure out how can we unlock performance, and enable that coachee to really step up and lead.
Okay, and that's a very good point, and I wanted to hear that from you, because I think that's a lot of that's a things that is in the back of people's minds as well. Now, your third scenario is around the
Mm.
executive teams that you
Yeah,
work with,
yeah,
and that's sometimes interesting dynamics,
yes.
because the board's probably told you get these guys working together, or
Mm.
is that something for the CEO itself?
Well, in the one active case right now, it is the CEO.
Okay,
He's brought in a team. Out of the nine, six out of the nine have just joined him in the last 12, 15 months now, right?
okay,
So it is still a very new team, and it's almost equally divided between um, people from that industry and people from outside of the industry, right? So the way we structured this is, out of the nine of them, I work with two other ICF executive coaches who are part of my Naluri team. And I coach the CEO, the COO, and the chief strategy officer. My colleague coaches the CFO, the CHRO, and another person, another colleague, coaches three of the other executive team members. So, number one, we do have a role in our one-on-one coaching sessions, but then we
okay.
also once a month bring them together as a team and facilitate kind of a group coaching session, a dialogue. Now, the beauty of that is because we've had the individual coaching sessions before, the three of us as coaches compare notes to look for where the alignments are, where the misalignments are, where are the friction points, so that we can proactively guide the kind of coaching conversations as a group to get them to unearth and realize that, here are the real friction points that they've got to address as a team.
Asra, do you then, because it's a team dynamic thing, use some tools as well in
Mm,
order to find? Because I would see that this is use of tools is so critical and part of this
yes,
overall coaching engagement. One, to see where the gaps are, where the alignments are, where the conflicts are,
yes,
and then working through your sessions, then either individually or, as you said, once a month, to
yeah,
sort of start to blend the team together from
yeah.
a cultural perspective as well.
Yeah, so I think tools are very important, and that is number one, not our area of expertise. So we do partner, for example, with uh, Pete and Helen from Aspire Consulting. They do a number
Mhm.
of assessment tools. We brought them in to conduct their work style assessments for each of the individual team members, as well as to put together a composite view of how the nine of them fit, right? Like you can see some patterns, and inevitably, interestingly, the CEO is the outlier, right? The CEO is the crazy risk-taking visionary, whereas there are, folks from finance and legal who are sort of more cautious, conservative. And it frankly reminded me of the exact same profile I had when I ran my leadership team at AirAsia X, right? Where as a CEO, we tend to
Okay.
be that outlier, right? And so that's
Okay.
also something I think important, right? Where your clients can kind of feel like you can relate to them, right? Like, why is
Okay.
this sort of an odd dynamic as a team?
Now I want to switch now in terms of the CEOs themselves,
Yes.
because, and let's look at this from a Malaysian context.
Mm,
There are CEOs, and because it's very, very different mandates. And when we were preparing for this show, we talked about this. The Malaysian listed core GLC CEO, for example, may have rather different priorities and things that he's concerned about or she's concerned about compared to the MNC CEO who has a different sort of stakeholder management that he or she needs to do, and also then different different priorities. It sounds strange, but different priorities. Could you walk us through your experience in terms of this dichotomy?
sure. In fact, that's a very common contrast. But number one, I think the most important thing we can do as coaches is to guide our clients to see that they are indeed facing, very unique stakeholder dynamics, right? They've got to kind of come to the realization themselves. For example, with that GLC CEO, not only is it your immediate board, but sometimes, because your board members typically represent, some, different institutions, who are the real power players, behind your board members, right? What is the agenda? How do you get two steps ahead of it so that you don't get kind of, in a way, sidewinded in a board meeting, right? And that's slightly
So,
different,
and may
and
I jump in here?
yeah,
May I
go
jump
ahead.
in here and,
Yeah,
and, and
of
and
course.
state the obvious? It is not just the institutional investors that perhaps your boards are representing, but also the political play and the social. If you're a GLC,
Yeah.
those are key things that you need to be cognizant of, because
Yes.
while you may be doing a good job from a dollars and cents perspective, if politically you're rubbing the wrong people the wrong way, that's not good for your longevity.
Indeed, right? Now, it might seem that the MNC situation is different, but it is similar. But then you're dealing with, typically, for example, the country head of Malaysia has to deal with the Asia Pacific political structure and then
Mhm.
global head office political structure, right? And
Yeah.
so, how do they also kind of really map, understand? And these are people across all of these levels. They change every 2 to 3 years, right? A new person might come in, and you almost have to go back to square one and kind of rebuild your ties. And that is just the reality of being a corporate leader.
Now, Asran, one of the key things, and we've touched on this, but perhaps we want to drill down a little bit more, is
Mm,
stakeholder management, especially board relationships, are
yeah.
so critical for any CEO.
Yep.
How do you help them navigate this board
Mm,
relationships and the dynamics around this? Because again, and let's use a Malaysian context as an example, compared to say other Asian countries. In a lot of Malaysian boards, the chairman basically calls the shots. In a lot of in and really sets the agenda and stuff like that. And again, I know I'm treading on treading on with quite a degree of trepidation here and saying that, but that's really the facts. Whereas in an MNC, perhaps it's a little bit more broad based in terms of the power base. Could you give us some insights into how you kind of help your coachees?
yeah. So a couple of things. Right? Number one, that's definitely not always the case. Typically, whether you're dealing with private entrepreneurs or even GLCs, the chairman may sometimes be the nice person that kind of tries to put people together, but the real power person is not the chairman. So here's where I think I use the chemistry session at the start of the coaching relationship to establish, in a way, uh, this kind of feeling that, hey, you know what, I think Azran can help me navigate the issues. So I'm very clear about, my sort of, in a way, whether you call it mentoring, experience sharing, or, perhaps my lived experiences and my learned expertise. I tend to share it more in that chemistry building session. And by the way, with the top level CEOs, it's not one session, right? It can be 2, 3, 4, 5 sessions before the CEO says, yes, I'm ready to now start an executive coaching relationship. And that executive coaching relationship, of course, you start to play your role more as a coach and then a mentor. But the number one story I share in the chemistry session when someone tells me about frustrations with dealing with their board is my own story of how I was fired by my own board of directors. And of course,
Interesting.
that kind of intrigues a lot of CEOs, right? Well, so tell me, now I'm curious, and now I want to learn. And I talk about how I went through a crisis situation in 2014, being the CEO of a public listed company. And in a crisis situation, I thought as a leader, I'm supposed to be decisive. And I came up with what I still think today was the right logical strategy to turn around the business, given kind of, a significant unexpected negative external environment that happened. And yet my board disagreed, right? And this is where you start to realize that in life, especially right at the very top, it's not about whether you've got the right answer in the spreadsheet, right? It's how you deal with, number one, recognizing that in a crisis situation, people are less open to new ideas. And I then asked this, right? Brian, you probably might have had a friend or family member who was hesitant to take a vaccine during the COVID pandemic, right?
Mhm.
And if you went to that person and kept insisting, hey, look at all the data from WHO, right? AstraZeneca 97.2, Pfizer 98.3. Do you think you'll convince them with data?
No,
No, right?
because
In
their
fact,
mind is made up.
the more you try to push data, the more they dig their heels in, right?
Yes.
Same exact dynamic in a tense conflict situation at the board. Now, I tell this story because what I want these leaders to understand is, okay, so I've got to play the situation differently. It's not just about, the right logical analysis that my team and I have built. You don't necessarily win with just facts and logic, right? But in life, I summarize it in this phrase: you need to connect before you correct. And that
Connect
connection,
before you correct. Okay, that's
yeah,
something that way.
exactly, right? And then I said, I'm happy to kind of help you find that out, because to connect, you first need to know who are the people that you really need to connect with. Because if you try to connect with everyone, you're going to spread yourself too thin. So, who really matters? What are the dynamics? How are they looking at situations? What's the agenda? And so, these are powerful questions that we can ask to make the leader go, okay, so this is not as straightforward as I think it is.
Now, Azran, from a cultural perspective, coaching for CEOs is relatively newer. It's been happening for decades in the West, but in
Yes.
Asia,
Mhm.
it's a relatively newer phenomena. What
Okay.
advice would you give CEOs and boards to sort of push them in the direction of being more receptive towards coaching?
So this is an interesting thing because actually I look back and I realize I've never had to go out and try to sell a coaching service. Uh, I get approached, and usually I tell them, you know what, I've already got 5 coaches this year. I'm maxed out, right? Let's have a conversation next year. Mainly because first I get invited to boards and leadership teams more of as a speaker, right? To either deliver a keynote for an internal strategy conference, facilitate a board strategy conversation. And in that process, then they'll say, hey, actually, you know what? I want to take it from just this one-off session, but can you help me work through these issues on a one-on-one basis, right? So I think number one, I guess I'll start by saying I perhaps help open eyes, right? By kind of sharing the stories, the failures, the frustrations I went through, and somehow people can connect with that, right? I'm not here to tell you I've got all the answers, I achieved this and that, but you know what? I really went through the struggles I did, including being fired by my board of directors, and somehow that resonates well with leaders.
Azran, it's been a fascinating conversation. I think we could go on for the next hour, but we've got to draw close to this. But
Mhm,
before we leave, any
mhm.
final thoughts you'd like to leave the audience with?
Well, I think, more and more the idea of that third scenario of working as a group is important. And this is where I found it also useful to have peer coaches, meaning like say we coach as a team, like in our case, a team of three. And not all of us are ex-CEOs, right? I think there's a lot of power in having coaches who come from different backgrounds. And when I notice how they carry their coaching conversations with their C-suite coaches, we try to look at where we're aligned, where we're different. It really enriches the experience. And I think there's a lot of potential to go from just being a solo individual coach to working together as a team of coaches to support teams of leaders.
And on that note, that's something for me to reflect on, and I think for our audience to reflect on. Azran, thank you very much for taking the time to be on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me again, Brian.
Now, we've been speaking to Azran Osman-Rani, CEO of Naluri. I'm Brian Fernandez, and you've been watching and listening to BizTech's Aha, the coaching show, which is produced in partnership with Corporate Coaching Academy. Now, this show will be on our website, www.biztech.asia, as well as our syndication partners, TV stations, radio stations, and websites. Thanks a lot for tuning in.